to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I am your hostess, Caitlin, and on this podcast, we explore all manner of things living history related, my research as well, into various aspects of 19th century life. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I'd love it if you consider following along on YouTube or on Spotify, subscribe, do that sort of thing, so that you will be notified anytime there's new episodes. So last time we discussed corsetry and what those who were actually wearing corsets in the 19th century thought about their corsets. And this week we're going to go back into women's health and discuss menstruation and gynecological health and around puberty and menstruation as they understood it in the mid-19th century. It's going to get a little technical too, and I am not a doctor, and so can't believe I have to say things like this. But just so we're abundantly clear, this is not medical advice. This is for historical education. Please go to a modern doctor if you have any concerns about whatever is going on down there before you start listening to people who put women into insane asylums for hysteria, okay? There are some wonderful things and thoughts that they have that we're going to examine today, and I want us to understand what they understood back then. But for real, people, let's not take medical advice from people in the 1850s. I mean, I can Google things now and get completely controversial, thoughts that do not match up and are exact opposite of each other on two medical sites now for gynecological issues. Let's not start listening to people who had just barely started researching women's bodies and really had no idea how it really functioned. So we're going to see a lot about how we've grown in our understanding of the female body. For this episode, we're going to see a lot of how our understanding of the female body has changed, evolved, and grown, and also maybe some ways that we have not progressed in the way that we should. So without further ado, let's get started. So yeah, other than actual childbirth, most medical professionals didn't actually study the female body until the mid-19th century. And so you find plenty on obstetrics and midwifery and childbirth, but very little about other facts of the female medical information. There's an 1832 book entitled Women's Health and Hygiene, Obstetrics and Gynecology, which, what do you know, I can't get online, at least not for that I can find. So unfortunately, we can't look at that book today. Most of the works we're going to study are going to be in the 1840s to 1850s range. I stopped my search mostly at 1869 because for the longest time, I wasn't doing anything living history related post 1865, so I didn't feel like I needed to research that era. I have since expanded my research to be 1889 because I do up to 1885 now within living history, within the 19th century specifically. And so we're going to read a little bit from a work later on as well. And periods can be a very hard topic to research given the fact it was kind of a secretive topic and you really didn't talk about it in public. This is an era where you really never came out and said that you were pregnant, even in diaries, which were expected to be read by people. Like, they wrote things expecting that they would be read one day, if not by their family, generations down the road. So they didn't put a lot of personal, private stuff in their diary like we would nowadays. So like, I've read diaries, and again, just randomly one entry in January, it'll be like, oh, our darling William made his arrival today at 3 p.m. and he is most perfect. And you're like, wait, you were pregnant? This whole time you were pregnant. I've been reading your diary for the last 2 years and you never said anything about pregnancy or wanting to have a child or anything. But then you go back a little bit further and you realize that the last day she felt unwell. Those days used to be roughly 20 to 8 days apart, and then you haven't seen them for the last 9 to 10 months, and you're like, oh, you were pregnant. They just didn't actually say it out loud. So there's a lot of secrecy surrounding the topic of pregnancy within the general culture, and so especially within their writings of that sort. So a lot of that was mostly discussed, in private areas, like a mother to a daughter or something like that. It was discussed privately, not ever written down. So that makes it very difficult for us to research what they actually understood. So let's start with what is menstruation and how it was understood in the mid-19th century. So my main article of research was Dr. Charles Meng's 1852 work entitled Obstetrics, the Science and the Art. And I'm going to probably butcher all the doctors' names in this. I apologize. I'm going to pronounce it Meng. It's M-E-I-G. I'm going to assume that's right. His chapter on menstruation begins thus, quote, women are the subject to a discharge of blood from the genitalia which returns very regularly once a month. This monthly periodicity of the bleeding has given it, among many people and languages, the name of menses, menstrua, menstruation, catamenia, etc. Among us it is called courses, periods, terms, monthlies, monthly sickness, unwell, times, and various other names, hints, and allusions that need not be summed up. The discharge is not met with in children, unmarriageable girls, or old women. It appertains to women only as long as they are capable of conceiving. They cease to be childbearers when they lose the power of menstruation, end quote. About the age at which menses begins to occur at the 1850s, Dr. Ming says, quote, the first appearance of it is commonly to be noticed among us at 15, but many are found to produce it at 14 and some at 13 and a half years of age. In general, women have ceased to menstruate after they have passed their 45th year, yet there are vast numbers who continue to be menstrual until they attain the age of 50 years. It is rare for a healthy woman to cease menstruating before she is 40 years old. Some, however, cease at 36, end quote. Today, I believe the average age to start one's period is 12, or at least by the Google searches I have done, which is not medical advice. I know I started at 11, and I'm sure there are many more people who are vastly more qualified than I to speak on why the age of menstruation or the beginning of menstruation has lessened over the years. I would assume it had something to do with diet, although in 1850s on Diseases of Menstruation by Edward John Tilt, he specifically says that in cold climates, menstruation starts at age 14, and in hot climates, it starts before 14. And it got me to thinking, because this part of the 19th century, the 1850s, is coming out of an ice age, a little mini ice age that happened in the 18th centuries. And so it's going to be a lot colder than it was today. And so I wonder if the cold weather really did have something to do with delaying menstruation and that we are having it earlier because we are now out of the ice age. Anyway, that is a thought, and I don't know whether it's true or not, or if there's any evidence for it. Found it interesting when someone else mentioned the cold climate, and I went, oh, there was an ice age. I wonder if that had something to do with it. So anyway, again, it's just a thought. About how much blood is lost during a period, Dr. Ming says, quote, I said that the catamenial discharge is blood. It amounts to from 4 to 6 fluid ounces of blood at each turn. This is the rule. The exceptions are that some women do not eliminate more than 1 or 2 ounces at a time, and that others never lose less than 10 or even 16 ounces of blood, end quote. So again, I Googled this, which is not medical advice. Personally, I have never actually measured my period and how many ounces of blood I have lost. So I felt the need to actually look this up. And apparently, according to Google, the average amount of blood lost is between 1 and 2 ounces, which is much less than the 4 to 6 ounces that Dr. Ming found, and I think it'd be a fascinating study as to why that is. So the next paragraph is the reason I found Dr. Ming's work in the first place. I was looking into historic ways to handle my period when I was in historic dress, because my personal belief is that if it worked for them, then it should work for me dressed like that. And in a moment, I'm going to bring out my contraption to show you, if for those of you who are watching and not just listening. Mine is based off originals in private and museum collections, but I do wish to first quote Dr. Ming's observations on the subject. Quote, for the most part, as soon as the menses are perceived to begin to flow, the woman applies a T bandage consisting of a napkin called the guard, folded like a cravat, which is pressed against the genitalia, while the ends are secured to a string or ribbon tied around the body above the hips. But I have seen some, not a few women, who assure me that they never use any other precaution than that of putting on a thicker petticoat for fear of exposure of their condition. Such persons must be very slightly hemorrhagic, since the want of a guard napkin would otherwise be sure to expose their condition by stains of blood upon their feet or stockings. Many female patients have assured me they never use less than a dozen napkins upon each catamenial occasion, and 15 and even 20 such changes are not very rare in the history of healthy menstruations, end quote. Okay, so I'm really hoping that the platforms I put my videos up on don't strike me for this one, but I'm going to show you an image that I don't have any reference for other than the fact that according to the clothing, it looks to be early 1820s, maybe the late 18 teens. For those listening, it's going to show a woman and a man in a slightly compromising position, to put it in 19th century terms. You can clearly see a bandage or a napkin pressed against her genitalia from wrapping from back to front. So this is my pre-1855 model. So basically it's very similar to what we saw in the illustration. There is a twill tape ribbon or otherwise a belt that buttons, but that is the ribbon, and then this is sewn onto the back, and it's just my little band. It goes all the way up through, and then I pin it on with straight pins. Yes, straight pins on right here. I've never had an issue with poking myself. Using straight pins to dress yourself is a normal part of the 19th century. This is my thing. It's just basically a bit of twill tape that goes around the waist, and then a towel or a napkin. After the band gets buttoned onto you, you pin the straight band on. So that works really well for me. It is annoying to, once it's on, to pin it and then you move it out of the way so you can go to the restroom and then have to pin it back. That part is really annoying. I don't particularly care for that, but I haven't found another way that, works better. So my later model uses the same band, and I'm not going to cut this one off just to show you, but it uses the same twill tape band that buttons, but it's a knitted strap. So it's really easy without any pins just to pull it off to use the restroom and then snap it back on with the button. This is very convenient, I find. Now personally for me, I'm a fairly heavy bleeder, so I have found that putting scrap fabric onto the band and using the band just to hold the scrap fabric in place works really well for me. And this may seem like a big deal for most modern people, but I use washable pads and period underwear in the 21st century. So for me, washing these types of things is not a big deal whatsoever. And again, it's based off of a lot of originals that I've found that date to the later part of the 1850s to the 1870s. I do think pre-1855, the actual fabric situation onto the band was more common, based both on Dr. Ming's description of the bandage and also according to that one 1820s image. I do think that the strip of fabric was going to be the most popular pre-1855, but a lot of the originals I see are dated to the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So I think the knitted band is really a new thing kind of coming out during that time period. So I do the historic thing and I use the bit of fabric pinned pre-1855, then post-1855 I'll use the knitted band for myself. And again, it works really, really well. People weren't stupid back then, as we sometimes tend to think that they were. So yes, it works very well. So continuing on to read about what Dr. Ming has to say, the next few paragraphs I like very much, and I still hear modern gynecologists and OBGYNs repeat basically the same words. So it's nice that Dr. Ming has, in the 1850s, the same understanding, but it's basically, quote, "It seems to be a very indifferent matter for the health of the woman whether they menstruate copiously or not, provided each one is regulated according to the habits, wants, and normal forces of her own economy. Each female, in menstruating, obeys the laws of her own special system and not that of another woman's system. Hence, if she habitually loses 4 ounces and is well, no attempt ought to be made to argument the amount of the discharge, since her 4 ounces are what she requires and not 12 ounces. On the other hand, one who has for years lost 12 ounces at each menstrual return might be deemed sick in case she should only dispense 4 ounces and no more," end quote. In modern words, there's no true normal for periods. As long as you are regular to yourself, there likely isn't an issue. Dr. Ming continues, quote, "Each catamenial period continues from 3 to 5 days, so that the subject is not free from it for any more than 23 to 25 days at a time, but there are many examples to be met with, and each its period of duration is not less than 7 or 8 days for each menstruation. In the duration of the flow, it is as well as the number of fluid ounces discharged. Each woman obeys the law of her own nature, and if that be fulfilled, her health is as good as to the duration. The young physician should not, therefore, feel constrained to take in hand a case because the number of menstruating days of his patient might be less than that of some other woman," end quote. And that seems to be on par, at least from my understanding, as to what is being said today, at least based on my Google research. He's saying 23 to 25 days, but that 23 to 25 days is the days without bleeding. So when you add in an average of 4 days of bleeding, you get 27 to 29 day cycle, which is still considered very normal today. So next, Dr. Ming goes on to clarify that the period consists of blood, not from the veins, as was previously thought, but that it is a discharge, not a secretion. He then lists other doctors and researchers and states that with their work, it is abundantly clear that the catamenial fluid is blood. I'm glad it only took till 1855 to figure that out. Dr. Ming continues, quote, "All that has been said upon the nature and the causes of menstruation prior to the year 1825 is nonsense, and that our real information begins to acquire some philosophical certitude from the moment of the discovery of Purkinje's vesicle, which cast so bright a dawn upon the nature and the laws of reproduction, and that, by the labors of physiologists and naturalists since the said date, 1825, our dawn has grown to be a great shining light, under which things are clearly seen and understood that were formerly wholly unknown or imperfectly comprehended. I repeat then that the menstrual fluid is blood. It is impure from the admixture of quantity of mucus and epithelial scales," end quote. I probably butchered a couple of those words. Again, no medical background here. So Purkinje, and I think I'm pronouncing that right, vesicle, from my understanding refers to the discovery of the ovum. So he found this vesicle in chicken's eggs and hypothesized that is where the site of the female reproductive cell, or the ovum, is developed. It helped other researchers find this site in mammals, including humans. So that is what he refers to in that whole section, that prior to 1825, they really had no concept of an ovum or an egg within the female reproductive system, whereas after 1825 and this discovery, they now have this understanding, and they were able to find it in mammals, including humans. Dr. Ming also calls the discharge impure blood, basically meaning that it's not just blood, which we also do believe today. According to Google, menstrual blood contains not only blood, but also the lining from the uterus, vaginal and cervical secretions, and also other fluids. Now, this gets to the part that is really over my head in understanding, but I will quote parts of what Dr. Ming says. What he's trying to do is figure out why menstruation happens. What is the process by which it starts? Quote, when a woman's body who has perished while menstruating or soon after the performance of that act is examined by an entomologist, he always finds that upon the surface of one of the ovaries a small bloody spot, sometimes as large as the head of a very small pin, and sometimes larger or smaller. If a delicate probe be pressed upon this bloody point, it sinks into the ovary, the point descending into a cavity which contains a minute clot of blood. This cavity is the epigraphian vesicle, from which the ovulum has made its escape by passing out through the bloody pore in the ovarium. The ovulum must be supposed to have fallen into the pelvis, which is where it is not to be seen on account of its minuteness, being invisible to the naked eye. Its presence in the pelvis could not do any harm if it were not fecundated. Perhaps if it were fecundated, it might, by slitting up the fallopian tube, be discovered in the canal of the tube, or it may be traced in the womb itself. End quote. Okay, that was a lot. Okay, what he's explaining here is that right after menstruation or during bleeding, if the woman dies and her body is dissected for medical reasons, they are finding a very small bloody spot on one or the other ovary. This part makes sense to me because my understanding is that the ovaries and the fallopian tubes are not directly connected. So when an egg is released from the Graafian follicle, which happens during ovulation, in or around day 14 on average, on an average 28-day cycle, or in my case, day 17 or 18 of my 28-day cycle, and that's why I say around day 14. So when the egg is released, it does have to travel up to the fallopian tubes to be fertilized, and if not, it just makes its way down the fallopian tubes. So my curiosity is why they are seeing this ruptured Graafian follicle during menstruation or directly after, if it ruptures as part of ovulation, which is the other end of the cycle from menstruation. I'm hoping someone with more medical knowledge can help me on that one, because it doesn't make sense to me while they're noting the fresh, bloody, ruptured Graafian follicles before or much after ovulation. Now, Dr. Ming does say later that when he dissected an ovary, he noted he could see marks from older menstruations, but that, quote, I do not mean to assert that an entomologist ought to be able to count upon the ovaria of the subject the number of menstruations by counting the scars, for many of the succeeding ruptures must take place through old scars, thus confounding or blending them together. What I wish to express is the opinion that a woman never does menstruate without rupturing a Graafian follicle and discharging an ovulum and leaving a scar of the hyla, end quote. So now we get into the summary of why menstruation happens as understood by the mid-19th century professionals. Dr. Ming says, quote, it is a common and egregious error to say that a woman has her courses because she has a discharge of blood from the genitals. I'm afraid that this mistake is too very common as to reflect no little discredit on us. A woman may bleed from the womb as she may bleed from the lungs or from the stomach, but she does not menstruate except she also performs the offices of the periodical ovulation. And in practice, this distinction should never be overlooked, since it is wrong to attribute to the operation of the physiological law the results of a pathological state and vice versa. From the foregoing, it appears that the doctrine as to the cause of menstruation is as follows. 1. Up to the point of puberty, the ovara do not contain any mature or ripe ovules. 2. At the completion of the pubic age, ovula are matured within the Graafian cells, and the woman continues to mature or ripen them as long as she continues susceptible of impregnation. That is to say, from the attainment of complete puberty, which is generally in the 15th year of her age in this country, until the age of 45 or change of life. 3. The ova contained within the Graafian follicles are matured periodically, in women once a month, and other mammals at stated intervals. I take it for granted then that the ovarium has the power to mature one Graafian follicle at a time, during which process the upper segment of the spherule rapidly rises above the surface of the ovary, becomes extremely thin, and finally opens upon a delicate pore, through which the ovulum, or the little yolk containing the ripened germ, escapes into the pelvis or is carried down to the womb after being inaugurated by the inflambilium of the fallopian tube. In those cases where the sexual orgasm takes place while the ovule is in the hyla or resting upon the surface of the ovary, the fimbria of the tube may seize and the canal may absorb and convey it into the womb. Where no sexual orgasm exists, it must fall into the pelvis and be lost there within. We have no reason to suppose that the infundibulum can explore the pelvic cavity and find the lost ovule. There is just no just reason to suppose that in a state of erection of the vector tubes as a normal concomitant of the menstrual excitement, as has been supposed. We know, on the contrary, that menstruating women are often languid and inapt to the sentiments that lead to sexual indulgence or appetite. These reasons induce me to suppose that the ovulum does not pass into the except under the excitement of the coitus or of orgasm. And I'm going to stop it right there for just a second because that's a lot to unpack. We've already talked about how the age of menses begins has lessened over the years, but my understanding of this whole ovulation process is very different from Dr. Ming's. He does say that the ovarium only matures one Graafian follicle at a time, which may be the case. I do know that both ovaries will produce eggs each month, but generally only one is released. He keeps saying that the egg is released into the pelvis, which no, the egg does go into the fallopian tubes, and I believe that's where Dr. Ming doesn't have the understanding that we have today. He's saying that only if there is an orgasm does the egg go into the fallopian tubes, which is not correct. You do not have to have an orgasm to achieve a pregnancy. I think it's great that that was their understanding, though, because there's probably a lot of 19th century women who are very happy with that concept and that thought process, but it's not true. I do find it interesting that his conclusion is that the egg must just fall into the pelvic area and just be lost, because in his mind, obviously, it wouldn't go into the fallopian tubes unless there was sexual excitement. Anyway, I find all that very interesting, and I think it's quite amazing that with the tools that they had at their disposal, that they got as much right as they did. But it's also very interesting to me where the solid knowledge stops and then they're just conjecturing after that, and it takes a while to gain a better understanding within the greater medical community. And you do have to remember, this is before germs were seen on microscopes. Germ theory was in its very infancy, and hand washing wasn't even a real thing in the medical world yet. Yet they have a very decent knowledge of the female reproductive system. It's definitely not perfect, especially as we'll see in a little bit, but compared to other medical issues and even just general medical practices, I'm actually kind of impressed that they knew this much about the female body. Anyway, to continue, part 4, quote, 4. During the whole menstrual life of a woman, extending from the 15th to the 45th year of her age, the stroma of the ovaries, which contains perhaps myriads of germ points, is ripening many Graafian follicles. And if those that are situated at a considerable depth beneath the surface should be examined, we might find ourselves at a loss to know which of the number of them would be the first to be fully ripened. As to those who have risen near, there might be less hesitation to point out the ripest one. They all grow perhaps during the greater part of the intermenstrual period, for we discover no signs of extraordinary activity in their evolution, except as the woman approaches the time of being taken unwell. As that time approaches, she exhibits the constitutional and local signs of increased sanguine determination to the organs within the pelvis. She is lumbar, is sacral, and cerebral pain, the fullness or tension with heat or warmth and weight, all of which symptoms are relieved and carried away with a torrent of the menstrual hemorrhage, which is the bloody and external visible sign of the extraordinary vascular and nervous excitement of the internal genitalia. Which of the genitalia? Is it the uterus or the ovary that is the focus? And all ovaries contain mature follicles. That I have examined. I have noticed the undeniable evidences of increased vascular activity as seen in the numerous... When I went into YouTube, no one told me I'd have to pronounce fun medical words.
Arterioles.
Arterioles, awesome, fantastic. Arterioles and venules, as well as the capillary tube, which in the immediate vicinity of the developing follicle. These circumstances led me to the conviction that the ripening ovulum in the last days of its progress to perfection is hurried through this process by a violent, almost explosive augmentation of the physiological forces resident in the stroma. Such augmentation of biotic activity can come into it only through the nerves and blood vessels of the part. But, seeing the potent, nay, the dominant influence upon the whole life force of the ovaria, whose stroma is the essence and physic of the female sexual nature, what wonder have we when we perceive that the influence extending itself to the whole reproductive apparatus and even to the whole moral and physical being? Is it not vigorous enough to excite the afflictation or emolument of the monthly hemorrhage? Is it the periodical intensity of the ovaric force that, exciting the somatic energies in general, occasions the phenomena of menstruation?" End quote. I may be reading that wrong, but it does seem to me that Dr. Ming is under the impression that women are being ruled by their reproductive organs and that they are the dominant influence on the woman, which, I mean, we have a brain too, so I don't necessarily agree with that. Anyway, to continue. 5, quote, "During the last days of the developing of the ovarium ovulum, the vascular circulation and the nervous intensity of the organ are greatly augmented, a state which passes beyond the boundaries of the stroma itself, and being propagated into the uterus and the vagina, renders them also the seats of sanguine affluxion and engorgement. Under such circumstances, the uterus increases in weight, it requires a redder hue, is more sensitive, and sinks somewhat lower into the pelvis. Probably the granular tubular matter of its mucous body becomes greatly thickened, and the vascular network that is found among the tubuli highly engorged. From such engorgement and affluxion, it is delivered by means of the menstrual hemorrhage, which escapes from the vessels on the inner aspect of the womb, falls into the vagina, and thence flows upon the outer surface of the external genitalia and is called the menses. This blood perhaps escapes from normal orifices, periodically enlarged, dilated." End quote. Anyway, that was a little bit, and I'm not going to really comment on that because that's stuff I don't understand, or that's something that I have not studied and is not my expertise, so I'm going to leave it at that. But next, Dr. Ming provides this perfect gem, which I think is hilarious because apparently doctors formerly thought that women's cycles were controlled by the moon. And I'm pretty sure there's a meme going around today where some people today even think the same thing. Anyway, he says, quote, "The former doctrines of menstruation give us no clear indication of a therapeutical treatment on the disorders so frequently connected with that periodical act. It was foolishness to assign as a cause of the menstrual periodicity an influence of the moon, since observation and experience show to all inquirers that there is no coincidence with any particular phase of the moon, some women being always to be found just beginning, just concluding, or midway between periods of monthly evacuation." End quote. Yeah, women are not werewolves. I'm glad we cleared that up by 1852. So now we get into a little bit more misinformation. So he says, quote, "True menstruation is the regular periodical evolution and expulsion of the ovule. It is ovulation. This act may suffice to cause a woman to bleed menstrually, or it may prove insufficient to that end. That is, for the most part, a matter of indifference whether it does or does not cause the menstrual hemorrhage. The essential thing is to mature and deposit the ovule." End quote. So my understanding of that is that he is saying that menstruation is ovulation, which is not the case. So Dr. Ming believes the most fertile period for a woman is right before the bleeding begins, or the very end of the luteal phase, which is not correct at all. Women are most fertile around ovulation, which is, again, typically in the middle of the cycle, so opposite end of the cycle. So that's very interesting, and you would think that that would be very easy to disprove, and we're actually about to get into a little bit why he thinks this in just a moment. So another interesting take is, quote, "A married woman who conceives in the womb does not necessarily upon the account cease to mature and deposit her germs. On the contrary, she retains a strong tendency to menstruate up into an advanced period of gestation. Yet she does not, as a very general rule, discharge the menstrual fluid. But there are many examples of women who actually do retain in the early months of pregnancy the power to pour out from the vessels of the womb the usual product of menstruation, an act that must lead them to abortion. Probably a woman who has a much greater liability to abort at the time of her menstrual crises than at any other time, which can only depend upon the occurrence of the catamenial effort under the periodical exacerbation of the germifuous force." End quote. So Dr. Ming says that the bleeding during pregnancy usually leads to an abortion. I'd argue that the bleeding isn't leading to a lost pregnancy, but it's actually the result of a lost pregnancy. And again, that's personally arguing, and I am not a doctor, so that's just my interpretation. And to summarize the next section, Dr. Ming then states that he has found that women who nurse their infant do not generally have a period for 7 months, but they are liable to get pregnant within that time, and that is why he concludes that a woman is still ovulating without bleeding during pregnancy and nursing. Now we know today you can absolutely get pregnant without having periods between births, but that doesn't mean that the woman was ovulating regularly during pregnancy and before. She just happened to have sex at the exact moment of her first ovulation, which if she did not, would have just given her a period about 2 weeks later. So Dr. Ming continues with his hypothesis that women are constantly ovulating even without periods, and he gives the case that apparently it is normal for a young girl to menstruate regularly until she goes to school, where it is common for her menstruation to cease until she returns home at the end of her term. He argues that there is no reason to believe that these girls are not ovulating because they otherwise seem perfectly healthy, but they just don't have any outward signs of menstruation. What I want to know is what these poor girls are going through at school, because only missing your periods during set times like this is saying to me that school is such a high stress environment for these young ladies that their bodies stop all non-essential tasks just to function and survive. And that's really worrying to me. Dr. Ming isn't worried though. He states, quote, "I have found many young women thus affected, but the health being in all other regards perfect, I have not ventured to interfere beyond the interference of recommending a lessened intensity of mental labor, a more abundant and exciting diet, and the proper amount of daily exercise in the free air." End quote. And then he says that, again, it ceases as soon as the girl's in school, so he doesn't think there's really a reason to do anything about it. And apparently no one thought that it's perfectly normal for girls to do this, and no one even thought that there might be something wrong with the school system for enticing this. I don't know about that. That's concerning. Now into the 1850s theory of impregnation, which I do want to touch here briefly, although this video isn't really about 19th century pregnancy. That is going to be its whole other video, but buckle up. So, quote, "As a rule then, a woman is liable to become pregnant only at and about the periods of her monthly sickness. And in computing the commencement of pregnancy, we shall commit the fewest errors if we begin to count at the day following that on which the flow ceased. 280 days should be allowed as the usual duration of a gestation. One who is regular ought to see every 28th day. If she sees for the next 3 days only, then she ought to be 25 days without seeing. In what proportion of these 25 days is she liable to impregnation? Dr. Pouchett says that the liability extends up to 12 days after the drying up of the discharge, but not beyond that time. It is perhaps rash to say so, and yet it seems improbable that the ovule should retain its vitality without fecundation so long as 12 days after its escape from the follicular pore. The Jewish law commands the woman to abstain from the husband's bed until she shall have become clean, being unclean for 8 days after the desperation of the last drop. Several Jewish females, having numerous children, have informed me that they religiously observed this law in all of their marriage. If these women spoke truly, they gave incontrovertible evidence that the fallen ovule retains its fitness for impregnation not only during the 8 days subsequent to the drying up of the courses, but even longer. Since we know not precisely at what period of the menstrual act the ovule departs from the cell, the above example proved to me that the rupture took place in the young girl previous to the drying up of the discharge, so that, in the case of the Jewish women, if the same rule holds, we perceive that the ovule may be discharged and yet retain its vitality without fecundation for 8 days and even more than the 8 days. But we do not know where it rests such a case. From the period of its escape, ovarian ovule, until it becomes fecundated 8 days later, I am clearly not called upon to say at precise period after the courses a woman cannot possibly conceive. I have no doubt there is such a period. Time and the opportunity to observe can alone settle this point. I am for the present very willing to believe with M. Pouchett that a woman shall not conceive later than the 12th day. Nevertheless, it may be that occasionally the fecundation may occur even later. I am much obliged to the young gentleman who gave me the following notes, in which I place implicit confidence. He gave them to me with the consent of his wife, who is the subject of them. And it just says Mrs. and it stars out her name. End quote. So all that basically to say that he believes that ovulation happens during menstruation, which we know is not the case today. And he's trying to figure out if there is a period to where a woman cannot get pregnant. And he talked again about Jewish law and all of that. I don't know why he's not figuring out with that. And I'm not sure with the evidence of like the Jewish women and all that, why he's not cluing into this. But I think it really does have to go back to when he has dissected female reproductive parts, seen the bloody spot in and around menstruation. And I think that's why he's so set on this idea, because his personal experience shows him that. But again, you really never know. Like the girls who passed away, maybe their cycles were delayed due to whatever was going on internally that, caused them to die in the first place. Is it possible that ovulation was just postponed? So even though you expected their bleeding to start then, it really wasn't. Their cycle was extended. There's so many things that go into that. But anyway, we are now going to talk about a young woman, and it does not give her name. Her name is redacted because this is a very private, personal information that he has published. But I do want to talk about this because it does have some very good information, and we will dissect it in a moment. Anyway, this woman, quote, 23, gave birth to a daughter May 30th, 1848. The child died aged 11 days and the milk dried up. August 6th, the catamenia returned and lasted to August 11th. August 29th, sexual relation, no result. September 6, 1848, catamenia returned and lasted to the 12th. September 24th, sexual relation. October 6th, catamenia returned, lasted to the 12th. October 25th, sexual relation, conception, plus 13 days. February 14th, quickened, equals 104 days, end quote. So to unpack this, again, it is now more common knowledge that women will ovulate more towards the middle of her cycle as opposed to right around menstruation, and that menstruation isn't the signal that ovulation has occurred. It's just a signal that conception hasn't occurred. And I really do appreciate this man and his wife who gave the doctor their fertility information. It does look like the wife ovulates around day 20 of her cycle, which is a little bit late according to my understanding. And here I thought I ovulated late at day 17 or 18. And it doesn't appear like she has a super long cycle. I know things can be a little bit off for a while after a miscarriage, and I assume it's the same for a pregnancy and a birth where you lost a child. And I don't know if her milk dried up naturally or if they suppressed her milk supply with medications or Epsom salts or something like that after the infant passed. It looked like after the birth it took about 2 months for her cycle to return, and then she had a 31-day cycle with them having sex on day 23, which was too late essentially. And it seems like they were trying to conceive and were purposely having intercourse at the times they thought the woman was most fertile, which was around her menstruation instead of when it actually took place. But as Dr. Ming said, they don't actually quite know when it happens. Now, the one time they actually timed sex correctly, as in a little bit earlier, that's when she got pregnant. And again, this is one of those things where, with evidence, I don't understand why the doctors, especially like Dr. Ming, was so focused on ovulation happens around menstruation, because she didn't get pregnant when they had intercourse closer to her menstrual cycle, and she did get pregnant when they had sex a little bit earlier. And I feel like that's pretty, hard evidence. I mean, it's one woman, which I understand is not the greatest sample size, but I feel like that should at least raise some questions. Anyway, I would love to get into the diseases of menstruation as well as their prospective 19th century treatments and cures. I don't believe we have the time, because although we talked about what doctors believe about menstruation, that's all well and good, but what were women being told about their menstruation? What was their understanding of their own bodies, and what was told to young girls about their bodies? So for this, I turned to The Physical Life of a Woman, Advice to the Maiden, Wife, and Mother, written by George Henry Nafies in 1878. Written to women, it is a good piece on what women were expected to understand about themselves. We will mostly be hanging out in his advice to the maiden for this video. He writes, quote, "In the anatomy of a woman, there are 2 small bodies in shape and size like large almonds called the ovaries. They lie on each side of the womb and are connected to it by tubes about 4 inches in length. These bodies are solid but contain a great number of diminutive vesicles, which by some mysterious law of nature mature one at a time every 30 days, for 30 years of a woman's life. When mature, the vesicle separates from the ovary, traverses the tube into the womb, and is thence expelled and lost, or becomes by contact with the other sex the germ of a living being. The process is accompanied by a disturbance of the whole system. Wandering pains are felt, a sense of languor steals over the mind, the blood rushes with increased violence throughout the vessels, and more or less of it escapes from the veins, causing that change which we term menstruation," end quote. So this is interesting because it seems that a little over 20 years after Dr. Ming, we now understand that the unfertilized egg doesn't get stuck in the pelvis, but actually does go into the fallopian tubes, whether it is fertilized or not. And he goes on to state, quote, "The ancients had a tradition that in the beginning of things, the world was made from an egg. The naturalists of past generations had this maxim: everything living comes from an egg, and science today says the same. For this vesicle we have mentioned is in fact an egg, similar in structure to those which birds, fish, and turtles deposit. The only differences are that the one is developed outside the body, the other within. One has a shell, the other has none. Therefore, physiologists give this definition. Menstruation is ovulation. It is the laying of an egg, end quote. Well, we improved on one thing, but I guess we haven't improved in that. Because apparently the thought is still ovulation is menstruation. And this poor woman trying to use cycle tracking to stave off pregnancy. I guess they would have probably figured it out after a couple babies. But then there's a woman who wanted to have children, who are having a hard time getting pregnant, so they go to the doctor and they get told this. I mean, how many women back then were told that when they were infertile and barren, when in fact they weren't. They just weren't timing sex at the right time. Now, Mr. Nafis is the person who is saying that specific temperature zone, girls should menstruate at 14 and a half, and if it differs more than 6 months from this, there's likely something wrong, or at least exceptional, and he goes into share the case of a 3-year-old who began having her monthlies and an infant who since birth has had a full functioning reproductive system of an adult female. Of both girls, he says they grew up without any other issue and otherwise appeared fine. But he also talked about historical figures who were able to have children quite young, including a wife of Muhammad who had a son at age 10. I'm actually quite surprised at his apparent flippant nature surrounding child brides and the terms that he uses. I know the Victorians did not have the aversion to child brides that we do today, but a common myth is that women got married very young back then, and that's just not the case. So according to my research, which includes picking the 100 women across Texas in the 1850s and picking out the date of their first marriage. So I found the average age of a first marriage was age 23. In 1890, according to census.gov, the average age for a first marriage in the U.S. was 22 for women and 26 for men. And that is not to say that they weren't what we would deem to be child brides, because we have picked the arbitrary number of 18 to be our legal age. I understand the line has to be drawn somewhere, and there is definitely a you are too young. And historically, yes, the age limit has been 18 to be an adult. I used to docent at a home that was built in the 1850s here in Texas, and the mistress of that home got married at age 15. Not because her parents desired it. No, she was 14, fell in love, and they tried to get her to wait much longer, and she refused. And so they compromised, and she waited a year. So she got married at 15 to a 25-year-old man. And so technically she was a child bride, which from the other stories I do know about Courtney, she was extremely strong-willed and typically got what she wanted throughout her marriage, throughout her childhood. So that doesn't actually surprise me that she was this is what I want and this is what I will do with or without your blessing. And again, her parents apparently just did not know how to tell her no. Of her 3 daughters that lived to adulthood, the eldest was married at 17 in 1857. The next one was married at age 25 in 1867, and the youngest was married at age 22 in 1870. So the Victorians did generally believe that a person who was menstruating was biologically ready for marriage, regardless of age, but in reality, parents typically had the final say, at least on when the young lady was put into society in terms of dressing like a woman and thereby signaling to men that she was of marrying age. And some parents did so later than others. In most coming-of-age stories written about girls in Ladies Magazine throughout the 1840s and the 1860s, I do find 18 being the most common age at which point girls are allowed to start dressing like women. And that is something I actually quite like about the 19th century culture, is the social cues in order to avoid confusion about who is how old and what is acceptable to be saying to a young person, based on their dress and maturity as deemed appropriate by those closest and overcharge of them. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, and really 19th century marriage and marriage in general within that time period and what women were expected to do in marriage and to know in marriage it's on my list of future topics for one day. So continuing with Mr. Nafis' book, he then has a few paragraphs about how he thinks that ballrooms, sensational novels, late nights, talk of love and marriage, highly seasoned food and strong drinks, to include alcohol, and then to a lesser extent coffee and tea, and children's parties stimulate the emotions and leads to an unnaturally early sexual life. So yeah, there's that. And that does seem to me a very typical reformed aesthetic society notion, especially of the later 1860s and 1870s and 1880s. That makes sense. You see the same thing in the L.C. Dinsmore series, which was first published in the very late 1860s up through the early 1880s. with the thoughts of raising children in the latter portion of the Victorian era. Anyway, Mr. Nafis goes into how puberty changes the body, including adding curves, the hair gets a shade or two darker, the voice changes, etc. And he finally uses the word uterus, saying that it and the ovaries will expand in size. And it touches on hormonal changes without actually mentioning hormones, but just mood swings. And I will need to look it up later, how much they actually knew about hormones, if they understood that they existed. Quote, "The once light-hearted girl inclines to reveries. She seeks solitude. Her mother surprises her in causeless tears. Her teacher discovers an unwanted inattention to her studies, a less retentive memory, a disinclination of mental labor. Her father misses her accustomed playfulness. He perhaps is annoyed by her listlessness and interior." End quote. And it goes on to say that it is the duty of the mother and the father and the teacher to know what is going on at this stage of life and to help and support the young lady through this era and cherish her through it. Now, he talks about the actual periods, quote, "In thoroughly healthy girls, it continues to occur at regular intervals from 25 to 30 days apart. It is true about 3 of the 4. In others, a long interval, sometimes 6 months, occurs between the first and the second sickness. If general health be not the least impaired, this need cause no anxiety. Irregularities are found within the first year or 2, which often right themselves afterwards. But whenever they are associated with the slightest signs of mental or bodily disorder, they demand instant and intelligent attention." End quote. To continue, quote, "An equal diversity prevails in reference to the length of time the discharge continues. The average of a large number of cases observed in healthy women between the ages of 15 and 35 is 4 days and a fraction. In a more general way, we may say from 2 to 6 days is the proper duration. Should it diverge widely from this, then it is likely some mischief is at work. In relation to the amount of discharge, every woman is a law unto herself. Usually it is 4 or 5 ounces in all." End quote. All the things that we've already spoken about, and I like that it gives a good range and says as long as it's normal for the woman and in these ranges, it's probably okay. I feel like doctors say the same thing now. Something he does say, quote, "Physicians attach great importance to the character of the discharge. It should be thin, watery, dark-colored, and never clot. If it clots, it is an indication that something is wrong." End quote. And I'd like to know, is he speaking of uterine lining clumps not being normal? I mean, they're not clots necessarily, but I could see that being easily misconstrued as being clots by the reader and thinking their uterine lining bits are not normal when in fact they are. And of course it is the Victorian era, so we get a passage on how menstruation is accompanied by the excitement of emotions, but that's just a lesson on how important it is to cultivate a placid mind and to hold our emotions on a leash of reason. Which, I mean, kind of I used to tell my first graders, you are 100% allowed to be angry and express your anger. You are not allowed to hit your neighbor because you're angry, especially when that neighbor did nothing wrong but happened to sit next to you. I love that we're allowing our children to feel and express emotions nowadays. I think that's absolutely wonderful, but I do believe there should be a limit in the fact they can feel the emotion and they can express that emotion, but we as adults have to teach them appropriate ways to express the emotion other than actions and words that are harmful to themselves or others. So if holding our emotions on a leash of reason means not expressing our emotions, then no, I don't agree with that. But if holding them on a leash of reasons means I still get to feel and express my emotion, but perhaps I'm doing it in an appropriate way and controlling myself in that way, then I can get behind that. And now we get to the section entitled Secret Bad Habits, which, yes, is about masturbation. So apparently this leads to, quote, "daughters of the grave, the madhouse, or worse yet, the brothel," end quote. And it says that if the habit is discovered not to scold or whip the girl, because it is often the result of disease or induced by local itching. It also says that girls who are on their period may be overly tired, and what they need is plenty of food, plenty of rest, and plenty of sleep. That she should be allowed to sleep late if need be and should retire early, and no hard work or anxiety should be pressed upon her. And something else I really love about this book, and it says that it is the duty of the adults in the child's life to talk to them about their body's changes and to prepare them. Quote, "Monthly changes be carefully watched. The mother should prepare her daughter's mind be time for such an expected incident in her life, thus preventing a useless fright or the employment of injurious means to stop what the child may look upon as an accident. Nor should the maternal care cease there. Such tender sympathy should exist on one side, such trusting confidence on the other, that the mother should acquaint herself with every detail of the recurring period until the function is thoroughly established. She should inquire into the duration of each epoch, the abundance of the discharge, the presence of pain, and its effect upon the general health. She should convince herself that all of these do not vary from the standards of health that we have previously laid down, or should they do so, she should not delay to use the proper means to bring them to that standard, end quote. And I absolutely love that. Girls should be prepared for what their body is beginning to do. It's not a surprise in the sense that just about every woman experiences periods roughly around the same age. So yes, parents should be aware enough to prepare their kids for something like this that's going to happen to them around this age. And this thought is also present earlier in the 19th century with the mother's assistant and young lady's friend in 1855, alluding to it, quote, "It is just this period in the life of women, which is the most critical, which she needs the watchful eye of a judicious mother, and when that mother should have the implicit confidence of her daughter. And yet how many mothers fail, through false delicacy, from giving that instruction to daughters, on which perhaps their future health and comfort as mothers depend. Oh, could I gather around me the loved pupils which for so many years were my daily companions in the schoolroom, many now teachers and many more mothers, I would impress again and again upon their minds the importance of understanding fully the physical laws of our being, laws which regulate this wondrous machine, the human body. Explain to a girl before she is 12 years old the mechanism of her body. Look upon her as a future teacher, nurse, wife, and mother, and let no foolishness, or worse that, wicked delicacy, prevent the lessons. It is for want of this knowledge that so many are made orphans in childhood, and so many females drag out wretched existence with shattered nerves and deformed spines." End quote. So yes, if the Victorians had knowledge that it was best to teach their children about their own bodies, why can't we today? Have we really not grown so far as to improve in this manner? At least hold yourself to this standard, which was written throughout the 19th century, of teaching your children about their own bodies. The next section talks about how much rest is required and how you really shouldn't be exercising during your period. I think doctors generally disagree with this point now. And something they did not get quite right back then was cautioning against iced or hot beverages and only taking lukewarm baths, which I think most would agree is nonsense today. On painful periods, the book says that they are due to overwork, being too cold, green sickness, or an over-attentiveness to social duties are to blame, and then we get into remedies for the pains. So wearing flannel next to the skin was a very common Victorian cure for all manner of illnesses. Using a hot linseed meal poultice, a mustard plaster spread over the abdomen, a hot brick or water bottle wrapped in flannel to put against the back, bed rest, a teaspoon of sweet spirits of nitrate or ethyl nitrate, or my personal favorite, a dessert spoonful of laudanum. Nothing like a little opium and morphine to make things better for your period, right? Laudanum was just one of those things that was just given for just about anything. I mean, it's one of those, oh, you don't feel well? Have some laudanum. Oh, the baby won't stop crying? Give him laudanum, he'll be fine. Yeah, laudanum is just used for everything. And it's fun. It's opium and morphine. I mean, yeah, it's probably going to help. We just can't get that over the counter anymore for, probably some very good addiction reasons. I do like how Mr. Nafis specifically states that it is commonly said that marriage can cure a lot of menstruation issues, but he cautions against that, saying if you're not ready for marriage, you should not be married off just because of menstruation issues, which I agree with that. Now we get to a very interesting part, at least it is interesting to me given Mr. Nafis' casual mention of child brides earlier, but quote, "It does not follow because a girl is capable of marriage that she is fit for it. Science teaches us many valid objections to too early unions. It goes further and fixes a certain age at which it is wisest for women to marry. This age is between 20 and 25 years. Until a woman is perfect herself, until her full stature and completeness of form are attained, she is not properly qualified to assist in perpetuating the species." End quote. I know that's probably going to upset a lot of people because of the modern thought today that women aren't just for childbearing and that our main purpose is not childbearing, which I do agree with, yes. But you do have to remember that there is not reliable birth control in the 1850s and the 1870s. And so after marriage, you are expected to have sex, and obviously children follow that. And so this passage is really making sure that the women are ready to carry and have a baby and that it's safe for them to do so, as opposed to the other way around of seeing it as they can't get married because they're not able to do this. It's more of a protection thing as opposed to that. So I know it doesn't sound right to our modern sensibilities, but it really is about protecting the woman and making sure it is safe for her to enter into marriage and childbearing because again, there really is no birth control in this time. Making sure a woman could handle a pregnancy prior to marriage was really about concern for her health and safety as opposed to just wanting her to pop out babies. And really we're just gonna have to stop there because we're getting more into marriage territory, and I did say that was gonna be its own separate episode. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research into 19th century menstruation and to gynecological health surrounding menstruation within the mid-19th century. I had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing much more on this topic. I hope you enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldier. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or a comment on YouTube. And also, please don't hesitate to tell me any topics you'd like me to cover for future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.